The sun hadn't yet cracked the horizon when Clara stood shivering on the warped wooden platform in Red Hollow's town square, her wrists chafed raw by coarse hemp rope, her bare feet stinging against the splintered boards. Dust swirled in, the pre-dawn chill, stirred by the boots of townsfolk crowding around the makeshift gallows, two crooked beams and a noose that swayed like a promise of death. Clara's once blue dress hung in tatters, stained with mud and blood from the jail cell where they'd dragged her after the accusation. She'd poisoned her employer, Old Man Carver, and emptied his saloon's safe before trying to flee. The E. Whispers slithered through the crowd. She's a thief, a murderer, a nobody who thought she could outrun justice. Her dark hair clung to her bruised cheek, one eye swollen shut from a deputy's fist, but her lips stayed pressed tight. No tears. No pleas. Just a steady gaze that met the horizon like it might offer her something the town never would. Sheriff Hollis leaned against a post, his grey mustache twitching as he chewed a cigar stub, avoiding her eyes like everyone else. A woman in the crowd spat, her voice sharp. Should have burned her instead. Another shouted, "Get it over." With, as the hangman, a wiry man reeking of whiskey, shuffled forward, his fingers fumbling with the noose. Clara's breath hitched when the rope grazed her neck, rough as a snake's belly. But she didn't flinch, didn't beg. She'd learned long ago that begging only made the world crueler. Red Hollow didn't care that she'd been framed, that Carver's son had pinned his own theft on her after she'd refused his advances. To them, her poverty was guilt enough. The preacher mumbled from a tattered Bible, his voice lost in the crowd's murmur, and the hangman tightened the knot, his eyes darting away from hers. Just as Sheriff Hollis raised his hand to signal the drop, a low rumble broke the air, hooves fast and heavy, thundering closer. A chestnut mare burst into the square, rearing high, kicking up clouds of dust that choked the dawn light. Jonah, cloaked in a weathered black duster, sat tall in the saddle, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing a face carved with scars and silence. His revolver gleamed as he fired once into the sky, the crack freezing the crowd like a lightning bolt. "She's my wife," he growled, his voice low but cutting through the square like a blade. He tossed a folded paper to the ground, a marriage certificate creased and stained, but enough to make Sheriff Hollis pause. The crowd stilled, eyes darting between Jonah's steady grip on his gun and Clara's stunned silence. She didn't know this man, didn't understand why he'd risk everything, but something in his gaze, hard, unyielding, yet strangely soft when it flicked to her, stirred a flicker of hope in her chest. Jonah dismounted, his boots hitting the dirt with a thud that echoed like a warning, and stepped toward the gallows, his hand steady on his revolver as he faced the sheriff. "Cut her loose, or I start shooting." Clara's heart pounded, her bound hands trembling, not from fear but from the sudden, impossible chance that she might live. The chestnut mare's hooves churned the earth as Jonah spurred her across the open plains beyond Red Hollow. Clara clinging to his waist, her bound hands freed but still raw, her body pressed against his back as the wind tore at her tattered dress. The sun climbed higher, painting the grasslands gold and casting long shadows that stretched like fingers, trying to pull them back to the gallows. Gunshots had faded behind them, but the distant thunder of pursuit, deputies and hired guns, rumbled on the horizon, a reminder that Red Hollow's wrath didn't let go easily. Jonah's jaw was set, his eyes scanning the terrain for cover, his hands steady on the reins, despite the chaos they'd left behind. Clara's head spun, her bruised ribs aching with every jolt of the horse, but she held tight, her mind racing with questions she didn't dare ask. Not yet. Who was this man, this stranger who'd called her his wife, who'd faced a mob with a single shot and a lie? The marriage certificate he'd thrown at the sheriff's feet was a forgery. She knew it, he knew it, but it had bought them time, and time was all they had now. Jonah veered toward a dry creek bed, dismounting swiftly and pulling Clara down with him, his grip firm but careful, like he knew her body was one bruise away from breaking. He led the horse behind a cluster of scrub oaks, then grabbed a branch, dragging it across their tracks to scatter the hoofprints into nothing. "They'll come," he said, his voice low, rough as the gravel under their feet. "But not yet." Clara nodded, her throat too dry to speak, her eyes darting to the horizon where dust clouds bloomed like smoke signals. Jonah knelt, checking his revolver's cylinder, each click deliberate, practiced, a man who'd lived by the gun too long to fumble. She watched him, noting the scars on his knuckles, the way his duster hung heavy with secrets. "Why'd you do it?" She finally rasped, her voice barely above the wind. Jonah didn't look up, just slid a bullet into place. "Saw you in town," he said. 2 weeks. Watched you scrub floors, give your bread to a beggar kid. Take a slap from Carver's son without blinking." He paused, his eyes flicking to hers, dark and unreadable. "Didn't look like a killer to me." Clara's chest tightened, not from relief but from the weight of being seen, truly seen by a man who owed her nothing. She wanted to ask more, but hoofbeats echoed in the distance, too close. Jonah grabbed her arm, pulling her toward a narrow trail that snaked into a canyon, its red walls rising like sentinels against the sky. They moved fast, the horse's breath hot and labored, until they reached a shallow overhang, hidden by jagged rocks. Jonah tied the mare to a twisted root, then pressed Clara against the stone, his body shielding hers as riders passed below, their voices sharp with curses. "She's worth 500 dead," one growled. Silas, a bounty hunter with a face like burned leather, his black vest glinting with a deputy's star he didn't deserve. Clara's blood ran cold. They weren't just after her for justice. They were paid to make sure she never spoke. Jonah's hand rested on his gun, his breath steady, but his eyes held something new. Not fear, but a flicker of doubt, like he knew this fight was bigger than one man, even him. Clara's fingers brushed the knife at his belt, her mind racing. She wasn't helpless, not anymore. As the riders moved on, Jonah eased back, handing her a canteen. She drank, the water sharp against her cracked lips, and met his gaze. "They'll keep coming," she said, her voice steadier now. "They always do." Jonah nodded, his hat tilting to shadow his face. "Then we keep moving." They mounted again, riding deeper into the canyon, the walls closing in, the air thick with heat and silence. Clara's heart pounded, not just from the chase, but from the man in front of her, a stranger who'd bet his life on hers. She didn't trust him, not fully, but she felt something shift, like a door creaking open in a house she'd thought was burned to the ground. The canyon's shadows stretched long and cool as Jonah guided Clara into a hidden cave, its mouth barely wide enough for the horse to pass, cloaked by thorny scrub and jagged stone. The air inside was damp, smelling of earth and silence, a stark contrast to the relentless heat of the plains. Clara's legs wobbled as she slid from the saddle, her body aching from bruises and the weight of a day that should have ended with a noose. Jonah caught her elbow, steadying her without a word, his touch brief but gentle, like he knew she'd recoil from too much kindness. He led the horse to a corner, then spread a worn blanket on the packed dirt, motioning for her to sit. She did, her back against the cool rock, watching him as he built a small fire, the flint's sparks catching on dry moss with a practiced flick of his wrist. The flames cast flickering light across his face, revealing a scar along his jaw, a story etched in flesh he hadn't shared. Clara's hands trembled, not from cold but from the truth sinking in. She was alive, but only because of this man, a stranger whose motives she couldn't unravel. She studied him as he pulled a canteen and a strip of dried beef from his saddlebag, offering both to her. She took them, her fingers brushing his, and the contact sent a jolt through her, not fear, but something warmer, stranger. "You said you watched me," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. "Why didn't you pull the trigger?" Jonah crouched by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames, their glow dancing in his dark gaze. "I was a soldier once," he said, his voice low like he was pulling the words from deep inside. "Fought in places that break a man, turn him into something that hunts for pay. Took jobs to kill folks I never met, never questioned. You were supposed to be one of them." He paused, poking the fire with a stick, sending sparks upward. "But I saw you, Clara. Saw you take a beating from Carver's son and still get up, still work, still give what little you had to others. Didn't add up to the thief they painted you as." Clara's throat tightened, her mind flashing to the saloon, the nights she'd scrubbed blood and whiskey from the floor, the way Carver's Sun leered, his hands grabbing, his lies sealing her fate when she pushed him away. "They said I stole," she whispered. "Said I poisoned him. But it was his son covering his own tracks. I didn't run because I was guilty. I ran because no one would listen." Jonah's eyes met hers, steady, searching. "I listened," he said simply. The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through her. She wanted to ask more, to dig into why he'd chosen her over the money, but a rustle outside the cave made her freeze. Jonah was up in an instant, rifle in, hand peering through the narrow entrance. The wind carried voices, faint but too close. Silas's men, maybe, or the sheriff's deputies still hunting. He signaled for her to stay low, his movements silent, predatory. Clara's heart raced, but she crawled to her pack, finding a small knife Jonah had left her. Her fingers closed around it, the weight grounding her. They waited, the cave's silence heavy until the voices faded, carried away by the night. Jonah returned, his shoulders easing slightly, but his eyes stayed sharp. "They're circling," he said. "Won't find us tonight, but tomorrow's another fight." Clara nodded, her grip on the knife tightening. "You don't owe me this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have walked away." Jonah looked at her, the firelight carving his face into angles of shadow and truth. "I've walked away from too many things," he said. "Not this time." Something shifted in Clara then. Not trust, not yet, but a spark of understanding, like recognizing a language she'd forgotten she knew. She lay back on the blanket, the cave's cool air wrapping around her, and for the first time since the gallows, she let herself breathe. Jonah sat across from her, rifle across his knees, watching the entrance, a sentinel in the dark. She studied his silhouette, the way he carried his past like a weight he'd never set down. Her eyes drifted to his saddlebag, where a corner of paper peeked out, a bounty notice, her name scrawled in faded ink. Her stomach twisted, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she looked at Jonah, his face half lit, half hidden, and saw a man who'd chosen her over his own demons. The cave felt smaller, the fire warmer, and in that moment Clara knew she wasn't just running from death. She was running toward something, someone, who saw her as more than a name on a noose. The canyon pass was a jagged wound in the earth, its red stone walls narrowing until the sky was just a sliver of fading blue above, the air thick with dust that stung Clara's eyes as she clung to Jonah's side, his arm heavy and warm around her shoulders. His leg was bleeding again, a dark stain spreading through the torn fabric of his trousers, where a bounty hunter's bullet had grazed him during a sudden ambush at dawn. Silas's men had come out of nowhere, their rifles cracking like thunder, and Jonah had pushed Clara behind a boulder, firing back with a precision that dropped two before the rest scattered. But the cost was clear. Jonah's limp, the sweat beading on his pale forehead, the way his breath hitched when he thought she wasn't looking. They'd barely made it to this choke point, a narrow trail where the canyon's walls funneled, enemies into a kill zone, but Clara knew they couldn't outrun the pursuit forever. Her hands shook as she tore a strip from her dress to bind Jonah's wound, her fingers slick with his blood, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You're not dying on me," she said, tying the knot tight. Jonah grunted, his revolver still in his good hand, his eyes scanning the pass. "Not planning to," he rasped, but his grip on the gun wavered, and Clara saw the truth. He was fading. The sound of hooves echoed closer, mixed with the low growl of Silas's voice, barking orders to his men. Clara's heart pounded, but something new burned inside her. Not fear, but a fierce resolve, like a coal flaring to life. She grabbed Jonah's revolver from his weakening hand, her fingers wrapping around the cold steel, heavy but familiar from the lessons he'd given. "Her in the cave. Stay down," she whispered, her voice sharp, leaving no room for argument. Jonah's eyes widened, but he was too weak to protest as she crouched behind a rock, the revolver steady in her grip. The first man appeared, a wiry deputy with a scar across his lip, his rifle raised as he scanned the pass. Clara's breath caught, her mind screaming. She'd never shot at a man, never wanted to, but the memory of the gallows, the rope's burn, Jonah's blood, pushed her forward. She aimed, her hands trembling but her heart still, and squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked hard, the crack splitting the air, and the deputy staggered, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock, before he crumpled to the dust. Clara froze, the revolver still raised, her ears ringing, her stomach twisting as the reality hit. She'd taken a life. Another man charged forward, Silas himself, his black vest glinting in the dying light, his own gun drawn. "You're dead, girl," he roared, firing a shot that chipped the rock beside her. Jonah tried to rise, his hand scrabbling for a knife, but Clara moved first, instinct overtaking fear. She fired again, the bullet grazing Silas's shoulder, enough to make him stumble but not fall. He cursed, diving for cover, and Clara ducked low, her breath ragged, tears burning her eyes but not falling. She wasn't crying for the deputy, not for Silas. She was crying for the piece of herself she'd just lost, the piece that had hoped she'd never need to kill. Jonah's voice cut through her haze, weak but firm. "Breathe, Clara, shoot to stop, not to hate." She nodded, swallowing hard, and steadied her aim as Silas's men regrouped, their shadows moving like wolves in the dusk. Clara glanced at Jonah, his face pale but his eyes fierce, and something passed between them. Not just trust, but a shared fire, a promise to survive together. She helped him to his feet, slinging his arm over her shoulder, and they stumbled toward a cluster of boulders higher up the pass, where the trail widened into a small clearing. Clara's mind raced. She couldn't outshoot Silas's men, not all of them, but she could outthink them. She spotted a dry gully nearby, its edges lined with loose stones. "Hold on," she told Jonah, propping him against a rock, then scrambled to the gully, piling stones into a makeshift barrier. She found a rusted canteen half buried in the dirt, its contents long gone but its weight useful. She tied it to a stick, rigging it to bob like a man's head, a decoy to draw fire. As Silas's men crept closer, their boots crunching on gravel, Clara lit a match from Jonah's pack, tossing it onto a patch of dry brush she'd doused with lantern oil. The flames roared up, a wall of fire cutting off the narrowest part of the pass, forcing the men to hesitate. Silas shouted, "She's just a girl," but his voice cracked with doubt, and Clara felt a surge of defiance. She was more than that. Now. She fired another shot, clipping a second man's arm, and he retreated, cursing. The flames bought them time, but Jonah's breathing was shallow, his hand clutching her arm. "You're doing fine," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Clara shook her head, her eyes wet but her grip on the revolver unwavering. "I didn't want this," she said, "but I'll do it again if it means you live." Jonah's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile, and he squeezed her arm, his touch grounding her. The fire was dying, and Silas's men were circling, their shadows lengthening. Clara knew they had to move, but Jonah couldn't run. She dragged him toward a shallow alcove in the canyon wall, her muscles burning, her heart hammering with the weight of what she'd done and what she still had to do. She wasn't just fighting for her life now, she was fighting for his. For the man who'd seen her when no one else had. The abandoned homestead crouched in a hollow of the plains, its sagging roof and splintered walls barely holding against the wind that howled through the dusk, carrying the scent of sage and the distant threat of Silas's men. Clara half-carried Jonah inside, his weight heavy against her shoulder, his leg wound soaking through the makeshift bandage, leaving a trail of blood on the warped floorboards. His face was ashen, his breath shallow, but his eyes still burned, with that stubborn fire she'd come to rely on, even as he slumped against a dusty table, unable to stand. Clara's hands shook as she eased him down, her mind racing. Silas's men were close, their horses' hooves a faint drumbeat in the distance, and this crumbling shack was their last stand. She barred the door with a rusted plow blade, its weight screeching against the floor, and scanned the room for anything to use. A cracked lantern hung on a nail, its oil low but enough. A pitchfork leaned in a corner, its tines dull but sharp, enough to hurt. Clara's heart pounded, not just from fear but from a fierce determination to keep Jonah alive, to repay the man who'd pulled her from death's grip. She tore another strip from her dress, kneeling to rewrap his leg, her fingers steady despite the blood slicking her palms. "You're not giving up," she said, her voice low but fierce, meeting his half-lidded gaze. Jonah's hand brushed, hers weak but warm. "Not while you're fighting," he rasped, and the words lit something in her, a spark of defiance that burned hotter than the fear. Outside, shadows moved. 4 men, maybe 5, their voices sharp as they spread out, circling the homestead like vultures. Clara found a tin of lantern oil and splashed it across the porch, her hands moving fast, instinct guiding her where thought faltered. She rigged a trap, tying a rope from the door to a heavy beam overhead, ready to drop on anyone who forced their way in. The pitchfork she wedged into a gap in the floorboards, angled to catch a man's leg. She dragged Jonah behind a splintered crate, propping him up, his revolver in his lap, though his hands could barely hold it. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice faint but steady. Clara shook her head, her eyes fierce. "You chose me first. I'm choosing you now." The first man kicked the door, the wood splintering but holding, and Clara lit a match, tossing it onto the oil-soaked porch. Flames roared up, a bright barrier that sent shouts of panic through the night. Silas's voice cut through, cold and furious. "Burn it down if you have to. She's worth more dead." Clara's stomach twisted, but she crouched low, peering through a crack in the wall, the revolver heavy in her hand. 2 men charged. Through the flames, their coats singed, and Clara fired, the gun's kick jarring her shoulder. 1 man fell, clutching his side, but the other ducked, firing back, the bullet splintering wood inches from her face. Jonah raised his revolver, his arm trembling, and shot, the crack dropping the second man before he could aim again. Clara's breath hitched, her ears ringing, but she didn't pause. She grabbed the pitchfork, swinging it at a third man who'd climbed through a broken window, catching his leg and sending him howling to the floor. Silas appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dying flames, his revolver gleaming as he aimed at Jonah. Clara didn't think. She lunged, tackling Silas, her small frame fueled by desperation. They hit the ground hard, his gun skidding across the floor, and she scrambled for it, her fingers closing around the grip just as Silas grabbed her ankle. She kicked free, rolling to her feet, and fired, the bullet grazing his arm, enough to make him stagger back. "Enough!" Jonah shouted, his voice raw but commanding, dragging himself upright, his gun trained on Silas. The bounty hunter froze, his eyes darting between them, calculating. "You're both dead anyway," Silas spat, but his men were gone, dead, or fled, and the fight drained from him. Clara stepped forward, her revolver steady, her voice cold. "Walk away or you don't walk at all." Silas glared, then backed out, disappearing into the dark. The homestead fell silent, the only sound Jonah's ragged breathing and the crackle of embers outside. Clara dropped the gun, her knees buckling as she knelt beside him, her hands pressing against his wound, now seeping through the fresh bandage. "You're still here," she whispered, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face, not from fear but from the weight of what they'd survived. Jonah's hand found hers, his grip weak but sure. "Told you, I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice barely audible, but carrying a promise that anchored her. She worked fast, tearing more cloth to staunch the bleeding, her hands steady despite the exhaustion clawing at her. The lantern's flicker cast their shadows on the wall, 2 figures intertwined, battered but unbroken. Clara found a needle and thread in Jonah's pack, her fingers trembling as she stitched his wound by the dim light, each pierce of the needle a vow to keep him alive. He didn't flinch, just watched her, his eyes soft with something deeper than gratitude, something that made her heart ache with possibility. Outside, the wind carried the last of Silas's retreat, the plains swallowing his threat, at least for now. Clara leaned back, wiping sweat and blood from her brow, and met Jonah's gaze. "I killed for you," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to, but I'd do it again." Jonah reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers. "You saved us both," he said, and the words felt like a bridge between them, fragile but real. They sat there, the homestead's walls creaking around them, the night pressing in, but for the first time Clara felt not just safe but whole, as if the fight had forged something neither could break. She rested her head against his shoulder, her breath sinking with his, and in that quiet she knew they weren't just running from death. They were building something worth living for. The border town of San Vero shimmered under a late afternoon sun, its adobe buildings glowing gold against a sky streaked with clouds like brushstrokes on a canvas, the air thick with the scent of mesquite and fresh-baked bread drifting from a small diner tucked beneath a sprawling cottonwood tree. Clara moved behind the counter of Clara's Rest, her apron dusted with flour, her dark hair tied back, a faint scar on her cheek catching the light as she poured coffee for a grizzled rancher who tipped his hat with a quiet smile. Months had passed since the homestead fight, since Silas's men had fled into the night, and Clara and Jonah had carved out a life here, a fragile peace built on shared glances and unspoken vows. Jonah stood outside, hammering a new board onto the diner's porch. His sleeves rolled up, the bullet scar on his forearm a pale reminder of the blood they'd spilled to reach this moment. His limp was gone, his strength returned, but his eyes still carried the weight of a man who'd killed too many and lived to regret it. Inside, the diner hummed with the soft chatter of regulars, travelers, drifters, locals who didn't ask about the past, but nodded at the couple who'd made this place a haven. Clara set a plate of cornbread before a young cowhand, her smile easy, practiced. But her eyes flicked to Jonah through the open door, a habit born of nights when danger felt closer than the stars. Their life was simple now. Coffee brewed at dawn, tables wiped at dusk, quiet evenings where they sat on the porch, her hand brushing his, their silence saying more than words ever could. But the past was never far, and when the diner's door creaked open, the air shifted, heavy with warning. A tall man stepped inside, his coat caked with trail dust, his boots striking the floor like the tick of a clock running out. His eyes, cold as river stones, swept the room, landing on Jonah, who paused mid-hammer, his hand inching toward the knife at his belt. "You're Jonah Gravehand," the man said, his voice rough from miles. Not a question, but a statement, like he'd tracked a ghost to its hiding place. The diner went still, forks hovering, breaths held, the rancher's hand freezing on his cup. Clara stepped from behind the counter, her apron still tied, her face calm, but her heart racing. "No," she said, her voice clear, cutting through, the tension like a blade. "That man's gone. He doesn't live here anymore." The stranger's brow lifted, his gaze shifting to her, sizing her up like he hadn't expected resistance. "Heard he was a killer," he said, "a bounty hunter who'd shoot for the right price." Clara didn't flinch, her hands steady, at her sides though her fingers itched for the revolver hidden beneath the counter. "He was," she said, stepping closer, her eyes locked on his, "but he chose different. Chose me. Now he's just Jonah, and this is our place. You want coffee? Sit. You want trouble? Walk out." The stranger's mouth twitched, not a smile but a calculation, his hand hovering near his holster. Jonah stepped inside, his presence filling the room, not with threat, but with a quiet strength that made the air heavier. He didn't draw, didn't speak, just stood beside Clara, his shoulder brushing hers, a silent promise that they faced this together. The stranger looked between them, saw the stillness in Jonah's eyes, the fire in Clara's, and whatever he'd come for. Revenge. A bounty, a ghost seemed to falter. He gave a slow nod, his hand dropping from his gun, and turned, the door swinging shut behind him. The diner exhaled, chatter resuming, but Clara felt the weight of Jonah's gaze, warm and steady, like a hearth fire after a storm. She turned to him, wiping her hands on her apron, and caught the faintest smile on his lips, a rare thing that made her heart skip. "You didn't need me for that one," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. She shook her head, a small laugh escaping. "Maybe not, but I'm glad you're here." They stepped onto the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the hills in shades of amber and rose, the cottonwood's leaves rustling like a soft lullaby. Clara leaned against the railing, Jonah beside her, their hands close but not touching, the space between them alive with everything they'd survived. The gallows, the canyon, the blood-soaked homestead. "You saved me from a rope," she said softly, her eyes on the horizon. "But I chose you, Jonah, not just to live, but to feel alive." He turned to her, his face half-shadowed, the scar along his jaw catching the last light. "And I'll choose you every day I've got left," he said, his voice rough but sure like a vow carved in stone. Clara's hand found his, her fingers lacing through his, calloused from years of fighting but soft in the way they held her. The town moved around them, wagons creaking, voices calling, but here, on this porch, it was just them. Two souls who'd found each other in the dust and fire of a world that tried to break them. Clara looked at Jonah, saw the man who'd been a killer, a soldier, a shadow now standing beside her, not as a savior but as a partner, someone who'd chosen her as fiercely as she'd chosen him. The wind swept past, carrying the scent of the plains, and she felt it. The weight of a life not just survived but claimed, a love not gentle but real, forged in bullets and trust. They stood there watching the sun sink, the sky turning to bruised purple, and Clara knew this was their beginning, not an ending, a promise that whatever came next, strangers, storms, or shadows, they'd face it together, hands clasped, hearts steady. "I don't regret it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jonah's fingers tightened around hers. "Neither do I," he replied. And in that moment, San Vero wasn't just a town, it was home.